This is the Authority Company Podcast, conversations with leaders that are designing our future. Hola, I'm Joe Pardavila, and my guest today is Graham Broyd, a British-American businessman and writer who spent nearly 4 decades in international banking and is the author of the new book, Backpack, Jacket, Surfboard, My Journey Across America, Then and Now, which chronicles his transformative 1980 hitchhiking adventure across the United States and reflects on how both he and America have changed over the past 4 decades. We're going to get into what inspired his road trip, what he learned along the way, and why he's telling the world his story now. Graham Broyd, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
I am well, and thank you for having me. Looking forward to the conversation.
You're very welcome. Hey, Graham, so I want to start, I usually talk about the dedication at the end of our conversation, but I want to get into a little bit here because you make reference to the fact that a lot of these stories in the book, you've been telling your family and friends for a long time. And it really kind of like touches a chord with me because I worked in morning radio in New York City for over 20 years. And there's only so many stories that you have in your life and you find yourself repeating it. And so I worked with a core group of people for an extended amount of time. And any time I'd go into one of the stories, I'd be like, all right, here comes a story about his dad tearing up the raft in Spain. And so it's always great to find a new audience for your stories. And that's a big part of, one of the reasons why you wrote this book is because you have decades and decades of stories that you've been drilling with your family and they're sick and tired of hearing what made it to you to now decide to be like, okay, my family and friends have suffered enough. Now it's time to write this book.
They have, because I do love to tell my stories. I've been told I'm a storyteller. And guess what? I'm often around my family when I meet someone and need to tell someone these stories. And my wife's eyes just roll. And she could complete most of the stories for me if I was doing it. So, I've told them for, over 40 years. And they're really at their core 20 stories that relate to the first time I came to the United States. And I'll tell you exactly what the stories are, just to give you context, if I may. So I was a student in England, and I won a scholarship to go study at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., which was a big deal back then. 6 weeks of study, flight out and flight back, and enough money for a cheap hotel and some food. And I decided actually that I would sell my ticket to DC and buy one to Los Angeles because I wanted to go surf Malibu Beach because I was 20 years of age. And that was much more exciting than studying in the library. And I thought, I'll surf for a week. I looked at a map like a very foolish European hitchhiker and said, oh, LA, DC, that'll take me about a week. But sure. No problem. And then I'll study hard for 4 weeks and go home. So that was the original plan. And those, what ended up being 7 weeks, the stories that came from that trip have sustained storytelling for over 40 years.
That's awesome. That's so great. And so in the book, you go back and retrace some of those steps. So I want to go back to you making that journey of going across America. And one of the things I think even as Americans, because one of my running jokes, Graham, is like, we're terrible at self-awareness. Like, we're not aware of how different parts of this country are. And someone like you, who basically probably knew America as like what you saw on television or what you read about, tell me about those little like micro culture shocks that you had along the way, because I'm sure there were parts of Los Angeles like, oh yeah, this is like Europe. This is, it's very cultured. There's all this. And then you get across in other parts, even California, and you're like, oh my God, this is completely different. Tell me about those little things that you noticed again, you're 20 years old, so maybe you're not as self-aware as you are now, but what were those differences that you noticed early on?
I mean, it's great insight, actually. It was truly remarkable coming from the UK with only exposure to, TV, in the US, most of which was based in New York City or California, right? The TV shows. So, I mean, just saying the names brings it out, right? So I was in Los Angeles. I was in a bull ring in Tijuana, Mexico. I was surfing on Malibu Beach. I hiked through the Yosemite Valley. I slept out in Death Valley. I begged on the streets in New Orleans, right? I interviewed senators in Washington, D.C., and I rode the subway in New York City. I mean, just those sound bites, for someone who'd never been to America before, I mean, were just stunning to me, right? The variety it brought and of both, landscape, people, cultures, ways of doing. I mean, it was just remarkable to me.
Yeah, and it's amazing too, because one of the things, I'm an Anglophile. I love watching like British TV and movies and stuff like that. And one of the things that you guys sort of like a running theme of the culture of England is you guys all talk different. Like, even though here in the States we have like our regional dialects, you guys have dialects on a street. Like, you cross a street, there's a different dialect. So what's different about the States as opposed to the UK, which again, much smaller, but it has so much diversity in terms of dialect and cultures and stuff like that. Was it almost like you were prepared for like the shifts in tone, but to a greater scale?
Yeah, I think on the actual language and dialect standpoint, what stuck out to me more was, of course, everyone loved my accent. There was no better thing to have, right, than a British accent when you were hitchhiking. But the thing that was more striking than the language was really the physicality of what I was seeing, right? The landscapes. I mean, think about it, right? Death Valley to Bourbon Street, right? Malibu Beach to the New York City subway, right? I mean, these, the El Capitan in Yosemite, right, to Tijuana, Mexico. I mean, so the physicality of what your eyes were seeing was really sure. The diversity of what I saw was really stunning, and I was, really almost accidentally, I was very fortunate that I had a little handheld, literally that big, Kodak Instamatic, right? People, of my age know what that is. Younger people have no idea. It was really a handheld, tiny cartridge that you could purchase that had 24 photographs in it. And so on this trip, I took 24 photographs. Can you imagine today with an iPhone, you take 24 in the first 3 minutes?
Right.
And remarkably, I was pretty disciplined. I wasn't very disciplined about many things back then, but I was pretty disciplined about managing that. So my very first photograph was of the very interesting looking air traffic control building at Los Angeles Airport as I landed. And my last photograph was me standing on Liberty Island with the World Trade Towers in the background in New York City. And so those 24 photographs sat in my attic for a long time, and I dusted them off and took them out, for this book. And really, that also reminded me of the remarkable difference of the locations and places I went to in those brief weeks back in 1980.
Yeah, it's definitely, the culture back then, and I was a very young boy in the 80s, but the waste not, want not of like, don't waste the film, because you mentioned there's 24 pictures in the camera. So people are like, oh, okay, so you could take 24 pictures and then like just do them over it again. Like, no, that was it. You had one shot to get it done right. And what was it about just having the one, what we call a camera roll? What was it about just having one? Could you not afford another roll?
I couldn't. And I have been fortunate in my career, and I try and get this across in the book. I had no money, right? I mean, and so I think if I recall correctly, that Kodak Instamatic back then cost like £12, so like $20. $20 in 1980. That was a lot. That was a lot of money for me. I mean, I was towards the end of the trip. I was operating on like $2.50 a day.
Wow.
And I literally ran out of money in days when I had no credit card, I had no phone, I had no access to. It's a concept that's difficult to grasp in 2025. Right?
Yeah, no doubt. And it's funny you say in the book that this trip was like your education. And I mentioned my radio days where I dropped out of college, and to me my education was on the job training. When you talk about it as an education, what do you mean by that? I mean, obviously life skills, soft skills, all that stuff, but like tell me about like what were some of the things that you really took away at sort of the education piece of it all?
Yeah. So that's a provocative question for me, because I had always thought that I had 20 amusing, interesting stories, full stop. And I was going to write down those stories. And then, and I mentioned this in the acknowledgement in the book. And then I was literally sitting at the gate at Sacramento Airport last year. And as usual, I was telling some of my stories to a small group of people. And one of those people, knew what I'd done in my career since then. And they just said completely offhand, "Oh, I can see how that person sitting in front of me became that person." And it was a throwaway kind of casual conversation comment that stuck with me and really made me pause and think. And so I mentioned it to, my editor, my development editor. And she said, the hairs popped up on the back of her neck when I told her that. And she said, there is a whole formative piece that sits in this book. And they said the first people in the editorial team who read the book, their immediate reaction on finishing it was, "What happened to this guy? Right? What happened to him? Oh my goodness, look what he did." And I had, until I sat down with the editorial team, that had never occurred to me, triggered by that one conversation in Sacramento Airport. And so I went back, and it was almost like therapy. I went back to how I felt in 1980, what I experienced in 1980, and then kind of plotted it through my life, particularly my business life, but also my life, and thought, well, that's why I behave that way. That's why I react that way. Oh my goodness, look at that. And it was a really wonderful writing journey. And all we did in the book was really keep the stories. They said, keep the stories as they are, because they all work. They'd been told so many times they almost wrote themselves. But between the stories, just, there was a classic example at the end of one of the chapters. I said, "Oh, and of course that had a big impact on me." And my editor said, "Graham, how, when, why? Right. Just give us a couple of paragraphs more to explain that, because I think, other people will lean on it." And so
You learned about the classic show don't tell. They'll say, "Yeah, I learned." Well, show us what you learned, right?
correct. And so that was, wonderful for me. And in the early previews, of the book, it is, what I'm getting back is evidently a lot of other people are picking up on that, right? And can see it for themselves. Whereas I always just thought, this is me telling my story, but people are clearly picking up on learning experiences, for the reader that come out of this book.
Nah, that's great, great. All right, before we jump into 2024 and you retracing your steps, we should jump into what is a sort of unhoused vagrant, a hitchhiker from the UK going across the country over several weeks. What does that person decide to do for a living? Did that trip sort of guide you? Did it open you up into what you want to do for the rest of your life? So tell us that decision you made once you went back home, and then what that led to your career.
Yeah. First, clear and easy one. I wanted to come to America. I wanted to work in America. That's where I wanted to be.
Goal one. That was it. No, I don't know what I want to do, but it has to be in America.
Well, that was really, at the core of it. Didn't really matter. I wanted to be there. Like this came across as just a remarkable, you don't want to sound trite, land of opportunity. right? To me in so many different ways. And not all the trip was positive. I had some negative events through the trip, but my overwhelming sense was this was a land of great beauty, a land of great, purpose, and it would suit, a young, ambitious person like me well. I initially, I had tremendous experiences on this trip in Washington, D.C., that stick with me today. And so my original expectation was that I'd probably end up, in the diplomatic corps, as they say in the UK, right? Working for the State Department or something like that. And through a confluence of events, I was meant to leave DC and go home, and I didn't. I went on to New York. And of course, then having got to New York, and I was like, oh my goodness, look at this place. And so, when I went back, I at least had, some sense of what New York City, what Wall Street had to offer. And so, I really, when I started looking for work, I really looked at my greatest opportunities, one, to travel, two, to get to the United States. And so I ended up in international banking. And of course, in true fashion, joined the firm, 3 months training. They sent me to New York. Bless them.
And that's it. And that's it. Never. And that was basically like, I'm never. Tell me about. I want to talk about this love of the United States of America, because I think this is one of the things where Americans are almost like maybe too. You know how the phrase, you're too close to it. Like we're so ingrained in living here that all we could sometimes find are the faults. Yet you see immigrants. My parents. My mother was a Cuban refugee. My dad was a sailor from Spain. So I know about the whole immigration process. And I think that being the kid of immigrants is kind of like in your soul. And I'm sure your family as well now because of you. But there is this thing about this love of America from outside of America that I think people don't understand. Like they just think like, oh, people just want to come to America because they can make more money here. But there's so much more to that. Tell me about your love of America, and whether it was just from your outsider's perspective when you're back home in the UK, or when during your travels, about why America is so beloved by people that don't live here.
Yeah. I'll mention two quick things. One, the national parks, and two, I'm going to come back to California. So I'd never heard of Yosemite National Park when I was in the UK. Never heard of it. And it was nowhere on my plan to visit. And I ended up there. And you got to put it in context, right? I'm a 21-year-old kid, right? Bumming around America, right? And taking on any wild opportunity I can. And my time in Yosemite literally stopped me in my tracks. I mean, it was almost like a sledgehammer. Oh my goodness, Graham, stop. Look around you. Right? Probably for the first time in my life, right? Rather than quick glimpses, going around places in England as a teenager, all of a sudden I was bowled over by, sheer beauty, this magnificence of the view, right? It just stopped me. And I call it in the book my pause for beauty. And again, it's had a lifelong resonance on me, even when I was hammering it in my banking career, on Wall Street, the city of London, right? The ability to stop for a brief moment, go to an art gallery or a museum, go out into the countryside and just pause for a moment and look at something. And so, Yosemite had a just, physical, stunning, magnificent beauty that was really striking. And, particularly before the Ken Burns, documentary series, who had gone to these parks, right? Only people in the area.
There was no Instagram. So,
right? And the whole concept of national parks, its maintenance, right, kind of relevant today, was pretty unique to the United States. You wouldn't find the equivalent elsewhere. And so that was, number one in appreciation of something that was, beyond my imagination when I first, arrived there. Secondly, I went back, as you mentioned, to retrace my steps in 2024. And particularly the early part of my trip, which was up the California coast. And California tends to get a lot of negative media these days. And I understand some of those things. It was stunning today, right? 2024, when I went back. Blue skies, blue oceans, waves, beaches, right? People playing on the beaches, not crowded, but, busy with activity. People going surfing before they go to work in the morning, right? Think about that. Beautiful beachfront properties, and, backed up by really wonderful farmlands, fruitlands, down to the foothills of the mountains, in the background. Some still, I was there in April with a little snow on the top. And I thought to myself, and I've traveled quite extensively, and it doesn't look unlike parts of the coast down from Cape Town in South Africa. It doesn't look unlike some of the southern coast of Australia. But it was magnificent. You couldn't create, to me, a better vista to stand there and watch from ocean to beach to mountain. You couldn't make it up. And there it all was, right? All the way up the coast. Right? From San Diego to San Francisco. Just beautiful. And I wonder how many people, even in California, who really, I stopped with a friend and who I used to know from New York, who lived just outside of Los Angeles. And all he did was complain about the amount of taxes he was paying. I said, Steve, stop. Look out. Yeah. Look out from your patio. What are you looking at? Right.
Yeah.
And I mean, really, appreciate it because it's there and it's really, stunning.
Well, as the New Yorker, Graham, I can say, I think places like New York City and parts of California, there is almost like people have a toxic relationship with them because they talk about the taxes, the overcrowded. And then you would say to them, like you, Graham, like, why don't you leave? I'm like, I can't leave this. It's 75 and sunny. Why would I leave? So it's almost like being in a terrible relationship.
And it takes a visitor to sometimes go in there and say, pause, right?
Right.
Take a look, right? Rather than focus on the negativity, focus on the positives, right?
Absolutely. I went to Los Angeles about a year ago, did a little business trip out there. And obviously, like you said, the negative press, like there's homeless encampments on streets. Like I was staying in Hollywood at a really nice hotel, which is way overpriced, but across the street from it, people were living like on the street. But then I took a drive up to, you mentioned Malibu. Took a ride up to Malibu, went to that Matador Beach where you have to walk down the cliff. And I'm like, this is
better than that, right?
This is like, I could drop an exfluent here, but this is amazing. Like, of course people don't want to leave this. And obviously people do. Like people after a while, they may say like, I've had enough of the taxes, regulations. That's fine. But by far, most people are willing to put up with it. Same with either New York City or another,
Yep.
at the blank city. It could be London. That'd be like,
Yep.
hey, listen, it's just too good to give up.
Yep. And again, what I found in the writing, and hopefully people feel it in the reading, is focus on the wonder of it, right? Focus on the joy of it, right? And don't miss the negativity. I have a wonderful photograph. You mentioned people sleeping on the street. I have a wonderful photograph of City Hall in San Francisco. It's one of my 24 photographs, and the area around City Hall in San Francisco is where they have the most people sleeping out on the streets. There's a couple of streets along there. I went back to it in 2024. I didn't find San Francisco bad at all, but I found a couple of streets around that area pretty bad. They were pretty offensive to walk around. And I have the picture of the same street back in 1980 with people walking down that street in suits carrying briefcases, and it's, again, it's stunning as a reflection, right, on the changes in America between 2024 and 1980.
I want to get into a little bit of the cultural impact of you coming to the States? Because I have a dear friend of mine who's Australian. And you probably know a lot of Australians, Graham, like they can't sit still, like they're always traveling, they're always going somewhere. And so for a part of his life, he lived in the UK, and UK and Australian culture is very similar. And he told me about tall poppy syndrome, and something that here in America, we don't get that. And if, for folks unfamiliar, basically tall poppy syndrome is like poppy, a field of flowers, you can't stick out. You have to blend in.
Yep.
And just reading your story, having conversation with you, Graham, you're the definition of the tall poppy. Like, I don't think the UK culture probably jibes with a Graham Broyd, but the US culture loves a Graham Broyd. So tell me about that. Like, do you ever have to deal with that when you're back home? Was that
What
maybe one
what
of
an
the
interesting comment. What an interesting takeaway from the book. And of course, you're absolutely right. But in all my therapy sessions with my editor on thinking through how I was in 1980 and how I am today, that one actually didn't come up. But it's a good one. It's a good one, right? Because yes, particularly then, and I think largely still today, the UK tends to be a little bit more of a culture is whatever you do, don't embarrass me, don't stick out, right? Don't be the odd one, right? Fit in and move along, right? And to some extent, when you think of it historically, the way I've often tried to explain UK to US and US to UK is everyone in the United States, except the native Indians, left somewhere else to come here because they were fed up with what they had at home and they wanted to make it here. Right? Oversimplification, but broadly true. And in the UK, everyone who's still in the UK, right, most of them, their families have been there for 1,000 years. Right. They have decided to put up with it. They are the Stoics, right? Now, that's the population there has changed quite a lot because they have a lot of immigration, right? And they have their own. We left our country and went to the UK. But that was certainly when I look back on it now, I was clearly not a Stoic. And I was clearly someone who was looking for their opportunity.
Yeah, it's always funny. That's why you see a lot of like your British, even Australian or even European actors. Like they want to work in Hollywood. They want to work in the States because back home they're like, oh, Billy wants to be an actor. What kind of job is that? And here in the States, again, we're speaking broadly. Billy wants to be an actor. Yeah, Billy, go be a star. You can be a star because
I had friends who did this and with all varying degrees of success. So think of it, right? You leave the suburbs of New York with a good education and successful parents, and you go and become a scriptwriter in Hollywood. What a crazy thing to do, right? No income, almost no prospects, probably, very few people but you're following a dream and you're following an ambition. Doesn't happen in the UK. Maybe one person does that a year.
You were the one in 1980, so we'll mark off 1980. I don't know who came the year after you, but we opened up this conversation, Graham, talking about the dedication of the book, and like I said, I wrap up the conversations, and you dedicate this book to Betsy, James, and Peyton, who have somehow endured and survived my relentless telling and retelling of these stories for over 40 years. Obviously, this is almost like an apology to your family, but why was it also important to dedicate it to Betsy, James, and Peyton?
Well, they are my partners in life, right? My wife and my two kids, right, who are both adults now, and frankly, I can't think about telling a story or writing a story without thinking about them. To some extent, I'm looking over my shoulder. Oh, can I start a story? Because my wife's not near me now. Because if she was, I'd probably think of something else to talk about. So that's really, it's just the natural starting point for the book.
And what do they say now that they've heard these stories for years, but now they see it in print? It's always funny with even as much as like quaint and old school as books are, they still carry some gravitas. Now, are your kids now like, hey, the old man's pretty impressive. He put this down on paper.
Not at all. Not in the slightest. They are the three people who are least impressed with which is good for me, right? You need to anchor yourself somewhere. They are the three people who are least interested in now reading the written stories that they've heard about for so long, and to some extent, that they all, to a greater or lesser degree, when I'm going on my book tour or I'm doing this podcast, roll their eyes and just go, that's Dad, right? That's what he does.
Well, for anyone who's not named Betsy, James, or Peyton, the book is Backpack, Jacket, Surfboard, My Journey Across America Then and Now. His name is Graham Broyd. Graham, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Glad to be with you.
And that's going to do it for this episode. If you want to find out more information about Graham and our other amazing authors, go to theauthoritycompany.com.